I baptized my son in a Satanic temple, but then God intervened. Ex-Atheist testimony. I was born into what you'd call a typical Christian family in small-town America. My parents weren't pastors or anything dramatic like that, but they were solid believers who took their faith seriously. Every Sunday morning, without fail, we'd pile into our old sedan and drive to the little Baptist church on Maple Street. The building wasn't much to look at from the outside, but inside it felt warm and welcoming. I remember the smell of old wood and the way sunlight would stream through those stained glass windows during morning service. My mom would sit between my little brother and me, making sure we stayed quiet during the sermon. Dad would always have his worn leather Bible open, following along as Pastor Johnson preached. Those Sunday mornings felt safe and predictable, like nothing bad could ever happen as long as we were there together. As a little girl, I absolutely loved everything about church. I was one of those kids who actually got excited about Sunday school. Mrs. Patterson, our teacher, had this way of making Bible stories come alive with her colorful flannel board and animated voice. I'd sit cross-legged on that old carpet, completely mesmerized as she told us about Noah's Ark, David and Goliath, and Jesus walking on water. The stories felt real to me, not like fairy tales at all. I believed every single word with the pure, unquestioning faith that only children seem to have. When we'd sing Jesus Loves Me or This Little Light of Mine, I'd belt it out with all my heart, raising my tiny hands toward heaven. I genuinely felt God's presence in those moments, like He was right there in the room with us. Faith wasn't complicated back then. It was simple, beautiful, and filled my heart with joy. My parents made sure our faith wasn't just something we practiced on Sundays. We had family devotions almost every evening after dinner. Dad would read a short passage from the Bible, and then we'd all pray together. Mom taught me to say my prayers before bed, and I'd always end with a long list of people I wanted God to bless and protect. We said grace before every meal, thanking God for our food and asking Him to bless the hands that prepared it. Christian music played softly in our house during chores and homework time. The walls were decorated with simple wooden crosses and framed Bible verses like, "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." Our home felt like a sanctuary, a place where God's love lived in every corner. This wasn't religion forced on us. It was woven naturally into the fabric of our daily lives. I threw myself into church activities with the enthusiasm only a child can muster. I was in the children's choir, where I'd wear my little white robe and sing my heart out during special services. I participated in every vacation Bible school, collecting gold stars on my attendance chart and memorizing dozens of Bible verses. During Christmas pageants, I always wanted to play Mary, though I usually ended up as an angel or a shepherd. I loved the Easter egg hunts and the church potluck dinners, where all the families would come together. Wednesday night youth group was another highlight of my week. We'd play games, do crafts with biblical themes, and learn about missionaries around the world. I even started a little prayer journal when I was 8, writing down my requests and trying to remember to thank God when He answered them. Looking back, I can see how hungry I was for spiritual connection, how naturally faith seemed to flow through my young heart. The people at our church felt like extended family to me. There was Mrs. Johnson, the pastor's wife, who always had butterscotch candies in her purse and would slip me one during service with a wink. Old Mr. Henderson, who ran the sound system and would let me help him test the microphones before church started. The Smith family, whose daughter Sarah was my best friend and prayer partner. We'd hold hands during prayer time and whisper our secret requests to each other, believing God heard every word. These people knew me, cared about me, and celebrated my spiritual milestones with genuine joy. When I got baptized at age 10, the whole congregation cheered and hugged me afterward. I felt surrounded by love, accepted completely for who I was. This community gave me a sense of belonging that went deeper than just friendship. It felt like we were all part of God's family together. My baptism was the highlight of my childhood faith journey. I had been asking my parents about it for months, feeling like I truly understood what it meant to accept Jesus into my heart. The night before, I was so excited I could barely sleep. I had picked out a special white dress and had practiced holding my breath in the bathtub. Pastor Johnson met with me that morning to make sure I understood the significance of what I was doing. He asked me to tell him about my relationship with Jesus, and I poured out my 10-year-old heart, explaining how much I loved Him and wanted to follow Him forever. When the moment came, and I stepped into that baptismal pool. My whole body was trembling, not from cold, but from anticipation. As Pastor Johnson lowered me into the water and raised me back up, I felt like something powerful had just happened. I truly believed I was starting a new life, washed clean, and ready to serve God with everything I had. Prayer was as natural to me as breathing during those early years. I talked to God about everything: my homework, my friendships, my worries about tests at school. I'd thank Him for sunny days and ask Him to help my grandmother's arthritis feel better. Sometimes I'd just lie in bed at night and tell Him about my day, like He was my best friend who wanted to hear every detail. I believed He was always listening, always caring about even the smallest things that mattered to me. When our family dog got sick, I prayed every day for him to get better, and when he did, I was convinced God had healed him just because I asked. That childlike faith made me feel powerful and protected at the same time. I knew I was never alone, because God was always with me, watching over me and guiding my steps. The Bible stories that once seemed so magical began to feel personal to me as I grew older. I identified with different characters depending on what was happening in my life. When kids at school were mean to me, I thought about how David faced Goliath with just his faith and a slingshot. When I was scared about something, I remembered how God had protected Daniel in the lion's den. I had a children's Bible with beautiful illustrations that I'd read over and over again. I knew these stories by heart, but they never got old because they felt relevant to my daily life. Jesus became very real to me, not just a historical figure, but someone I could have a personal relationship with. I'd imagine what it would be like to walk beside him on those dusty roads in Palestine, to hear his voice in person, to see the miracles he performed. My faith felt alive, dynamic, and full of possibilities. Our church organized mission trips and outreach programs that further deepened my commitment to serving God. Even as a young person, I helped pack care packages for families in need and participated in canned food drives. I remember feeling so proud when I could donate my own allowance money to help build a well in Africa. These activities taught me that faith wasn't just about what happened inside the church walls. It was about loving and helping other people. I began to see myself as part of something much bigger than my small town and my small life. God had a plan not just for me, but for the whole world, and I wanted to be part of it. This sense of purpose and belonging filled me with excitement about my future and confidence that God would use my life for something meaningful. Looking back now, I can see how pure and untainted my faith was during those childhood years. There were no doubts, no questions that couldn't be answered with a simple, "God knows best," or "His ways are higher than our ways." I trusted completely in God's love, His protection, and His plan for my life. The world seemed orderly and safe, with clear distinctions between right and wrong, good and evil. I believed that if I loved God and tried to live according to His word, He would bless my life and keep me from harm. That innocent faith was beautiful in its simplicity, and for many years, it sustained me through the normal ups and downs of growing up. I had no idea that life would soon present challenges that would shake this foundation to its very core, testing everything I thought I knew about God, faith, and the way the world really works. When I turned 13, something began to shift inside me. It wasn't dramatic at first, just small questions that started popping up during Sunday sermons. I'd sit there listening to Pastor Johnson talk about God's perfect plan, but then I'd think about Jenny Morrison, a girl in my grade who had been diagnosed with leukemia. Why would a loving God let a 12-year-old suffer like that? When I asked my mom about it, she gave me the standard answer about God's mysterious ways and how everything works together for good. But that answer, which had satisfied me as a child, suddenly felt hollow and inadequate. I started noticing other things, too. The homeless man who sat outside our grocery store. The news stories about natural disasters killing thousands of people. If God was all-powerful and all-loving, why didn't He just stop these terrible things from happening? These weren't rebellious thoughts, just honest questions from a teenager trying to make sense of the world around her. High school brought new challenges to my faith that I wasn't prepared for. In my biology class, Mrs. Chen taught us about evolution, carbon dating, and the age of the universe. According to science, the Earth was billions of years old, not thousands like I'd been taught in Sunday school. Species evolved over millions of years through natural selection, not through special creation in 6 days. At first, I tried to reconcile these ideas with my faith, thinking maybe God used evolution as his method of creation. But the more I learned, the harder it became to fit scientific facts into my biblical worldview. I remember staying up late one night, trying to figure out how Noah could have fit all the world's species on one ark, or how light from distant galaxies could reach us if the universe was only 6,000 years old. My head began to hurt from trying to force puzzle pieces that clearly didn't fit together. For the first time in my life, I wondered if maybe the Bible wasn't meant to be taken literally. The youth pastor at our church, Dave, was only 25 and seemed really cool compared to the older adults in leadership. He drove a motorcycle and played guitar during worship, and all the teenagers thought he was awesome. But when I approached him with my questions about science and faith, his responses disappointed me. He told me that Satan was using secular education to plant seeds of doubt in my mind. He said I needed to have faith like a child and stop asking questions that led me away from God. When I pressed him about dinosaurs and geological evidence, he handed me a book about young Earth creationism that explained away all the scientific evidence with theories that seemed forced and desperate. I wanted to believe what he was telling me, but deep down, it felt like he was asking me to ignore obvious facts and just blindly accept what I was told. That was the first time I realized that asking honest questions was being treated as a threat to my faith, not a natural part of spiritual growth. My parents noticed that I was becoming more withdrawn during family devotions and less enthusiastic about church activities. When they asked what was wrong, I tried to explain my struggles with reconciling science and faith. Dad's reaction was immediate and stern. He told me I was being influenced by worldly thinking and needed to get back to basics. He took away some of my books and limited my internet access, saying I was filling my mind with lies from secular sources. Mom was gentler but equally concerned, organizing special meetings with Pastor Johnson to help me work through my doubts. But instead of addressing my actual questions, these conversations focused on the importance of faith and the danger of relying too much on human understanding. I felt like nobody was really listening to what I was struggling with. They were so focused on fixing my doubt that they missed the real issue. I was desperately trying to find truth, not run away from God. Around this time, I started paying closer attention to inconsistencies I noticed in the Bible itself. During our family Bible study, I began pointing out contradictions between different accounts of the same events, or places where the moral teachings seemed to conflict with each other. Why did the God of the Old Testament command the Israelites to completely destroy entire cities, including women and children? But then Jesus taught us to love our enemies. How could an all-knowing God regret making humanity and decide to flood the earth? Why were there two different genealogies for Jesus that didn't match up? When I brought up these observations, my family accused me of being argumentative and looking for problems instead of seeking spiritual truth. But I wasn't trying to be difficult. I genuinely wanted these things to make sense. The more people told me to just have faith and stop asking questions, the more isolated and confused I felt. My doubts began affecting my prayer life in ways that scared me. Instead of the easy, natural conversations I used to have with God, prayer became forced and awkward. I'd kneel beside my bed like always, but the words felt empty and one-sided. Sometimes I'd sit there in silence, waiting to feel God's presence the way I used to, but there was nothing, just me talking to what felt like empty air. I started wondering if all those times I thought I felt God, I was just experiencing emotions or psychological responses that I mistakenly attributed to divine presence. Maybe the peace I felt during worship was just the comfort of familiar routine and community belonging. The thought terrified me because prayer had always been my refuge, my way of connecting with the divine. Without that sense of connection, I felt spiritually orphaned and alone in a way I'd never experienced before. School became my escape from the religious pressure at home. I excelled in my science classes and loved learning about astronomy, biology, and physics. The natural world revealed through scientific study seemed far more magnificent and awe-inspiring than the simple creation story I'd grown up with. I discovered that the universe was vast beyond imagination, filled with billions of galaxies and wonders that dwarfed our tiny planet. Evolution showed the incredible interconnectedness of all living things, and the beautiful complexity that emerged from natural processes over deep time. Part of me wondered if this scientific understanding of reality was actually more worthy of worship than the anthropomorphic God of my childhood. But admitting that felt like betrayal of everything I'd been raised to believe. I was caught between two worldviews that seemed impossible to reconcile, and the tension was eating away at my peace of mind. My relationships at church began to suffer as my doubts became more apparent. Friends in youth groups started treating me differently, like I was dangerous or contagious. When I'd raise questions during Bible study, other teenagers would exchange worried glances, and the youth leaders would quickly change the subject. Sarah, my childhood best friend and prayer partner, began avoiding me after I shared some of my struggles with her. She told her mother about our conversation, and soon Mrs. Smith was calling my parents with concerns about my spiritual state. I felt like I was being punished for being honest about my faith journey. The community that had once embraced and celebrated me now viewed me with suspicion and concern. Instead of helping me work through my questions, they were pushing me away, making me feel like doubt was a sin, rather than a normal part of growing up. The more isolated I felt at church, the more I began to identify with skeptical voices I encountered online and in books. I discovered authors who had walked away from Christianity and found intellectual freedom in secular worldviews. Their stories resonated with me because they described the same struggles I was experiencing, the feeling of being trapped between honesty and loyalty, between truth-seeking and community belonging. These writers didn't seem angry or rebellious. They seemed thoughtful and rational, people who had followed evidence wherever it led them. I began to wonder if maybe faith wasn't a virtue, but a limitation. A way of avoiding difficult questions, rather than seeking real answers. The idea both excited and terrified me. If I let go of faith, what would replace it? Who would I become if I wasn't a Christian? By the time I turned 16, the foundation of my childhood faith had developed serious cracks that I couldn't ignore or repair. I still went through the motions of church attendance and family devotions, but my heart wasn't in it anymore. I felt like I was living a lie, pretending to believe things that no longer made sense to me, while desperately hoping that somehow my faith would return. The simple, beautiful trust I'd had as a child seemed gone forever, replaced by questions that multiplied faster than answers. I didn't know it yet, but these doubts were just the beginning of a much longer and darker journey away from the God I'd once loved with all my heart. The cracks in my faith were widening into chasms, and I was about to discover just how deep they could go. Everything changed on a Tuesday morning in October during my junior year of high school. I was getting ready for school when Mom burst into my room, her face pale and streaked with tears. She could barely get the words out. There had been an accident. My little brother Michael, who was only 14, had been hit by a drunk driver while riding his bike to school. He was in critical condition at the hospital, and we needed to get there immediately. The drive to the hospital felt like the longest 20 minutes of my life. I kept praying desperately, bargaining with God, promising him anything if he would just let Michael be okay. I told God I would stop questioning him, stop doubting, and dedicate my whole life to serving him, if he would just heal my brother. Michael had always been the good kid, the one who never questioned faith or caused trouble. If anyone deserved God's protection, it was him. We spent 3 agonizing days in the hospital waiting room, surrounded by church family who came to pray and support us. Pastor Johnson was there almost constantly, leading prayer circles and reminding us that God was in control. Everyone kept saying that Michael was going to be fine, that God had a plan, and that this was all going to work out for good somehow. I wanted to believe them so badly. I prayed more in those 3 days than I had in the previous 3 years combined. I begged God to show his power, to prove that he was real and loving by healing my innocent little brother. Other families from church shared testimonies of miraculous healings they had witnessed, feeding my hope that God was going to come through for us. The doctors were doing everything they could, but we all knew that ultimately, Michael's life was in God's hands. On Friday morning, the doctors called us into a private room. Michael's brain injuries were too severe, and he wasn't going to recover. They recommended that we consider removing life support because he was never going to wake up. I felt like someone had punched me in the stomach and all the air had left my lungs. This couldn't be happening. God was supposed to heal him. All those people had been praying, believing, trusting that God would intervene. My parents were devastated, clinging to each other and sobbing. Pastor Johnson put his hand on Dad's shoulder and said something about God needing another angel in heaven, but his words sounded hollow and meaningless. I looked at Michael lying there in that hospital bed, so young and full of potential, and I felt something break inside my chest. Where was the God who was supposed to protect the innocent? Where was the God who promised to answer prayer? The funeral was a blur of well-meaning people saying things that made no sense to me. They talked about God's perfect timing and how Michael was in a better place now. They said that God had called him home because his work on earth was finished. But what work? He was 14 years old. He hadn't even had a chance to live yet, to fall in love, to go to college, to become the man he was supposed to be. Pastor Johnson preached about how death had no victory for believers, how we would see Michael again in heaven. But I didn't want to see him in heaven someday. I wanted him here, alive, annoying me by stealing my French fries and playing his music too loud. The promises of eternal reunion felt like cheap consolation prizes compared to the brutal reality that my little brother was never coming home again. After the funeral, everyone expected our family to find comfort in our faith, to lean into God during this difficult time. But I couldn't do it. Every time someone told me that God had a plan, I wanted to scream. What kind of plan involved a drunk driver killing an innocent kid? What kind of loving father would allow his child to suffer and die when he had the power to prevent it? I couldn't understand how the same God who supposedly loved Michael more than we did could just sit by and watch him get destroyed. The standard answers about God's mysterious ways and trusting his wisdom felt like insults to my intelligence and my grief. I was angry at everyone who seemed to accept this tragedy so easily, who could just shrug their shoulders and say, "God knows best," while my family was falling apart. My parents dealt with their grief by diving deeper into their faith, spending even more time at church and in prayer. They found comfort in believing that Michael was safe in Jesus' arms, free from pain and waiting for us in glory. But their increased devotion only made me feel more isolated and confused. How could they worship a God who had failed to protect their son? How could they thank him for taking Michael to heaven when they would have given anything to keep him here on earth? I felt like I was grieving alone, surrounded by people who seemed to have access to a peace and understanding that was completely foreign to me. Their faith appeared stronger than ever, while mine was crumbling into dust. I stopped praying altogether because it felt pointless and cruel. What was the point of talking to someone who either couldn't or wouldn't help when you needed him most? All those years of bedtime prayers, of trusting that God was watching over our family, had been meaningless. He had let the worst possible thing happen despite all our faith and devotion. I felt like I'd been lied to my entire life, told that God was good and protective when the evidence clearly showed otherwise. The God I had loved and trusted as a child now seemed either powerless, uncaring, or non-existent. None of those options left room for the kind of relationship I'd thought we had. School became even more of an escape, but now I was escaping grief as much as religious pressure. My friends didn't know what to say to me, and I didn't want their sympathy anyway. I threw myself into my studies, particularly enjoying philosophy class, where we discussed different worldviews and questioned fundamental assumptions about reality. Learning about philosophers who had grappled with the problem of suffering and evil gave me a vocabulary for thoughts I'd never been able to express. If God was all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good, then evil shouldn't exist. But evil obviously did exist. I had experienced it firsthand. Either God wasn't as powerful as claimed, wasn't as good as claimed, or didn't exist at all. For the first time, the possibility that there was no God began to seem not just thinkable, but reasonable. The church's response to my obvious spiritual struggle was to increase pressure rather than provide space for my questions. People would corner me after services to remind me that Michael was in heaven and I'd see him again if I just kept the faith. Youth leaders organized special counseling sessions to help me work through my anger at God, but I didn't want to work through it. I wanted someone to acknowledge that maybe my anger was justified. Maybe the problem wasn't with my faith response to tragedy, but with the promise of a loving God in the first place. When I tried to express these thoughts, I was told I was just hurting and would feel differently once I processed my grief properly. But this wasn't just emotional pain talking. It was clear thinking about contradictory claims I'd believed my whole life. 6 months after Michael's death, I realized that my faith wasn't just damaged, it was completely gone. I no longer believed in a personal God who heard prayers and intervened in human affairs. The evidence against such a being was overwhelming, and Michael's death was just the final proof I needed. I still went to church to keep peace with my parents, who were already dealing with enough pain. But inside, I was done. The God of my childhood had failed the ultimate test, and I was ready to figure out how to live without him. I didn't know yet where this newfound atheism would lead me, But anything seemed better than continuing to believe in a deity who would let innocent children die while their families begged for mercy. In the months following Michael's death, I started seeing our church community through different eyes. The rose-colored glasses of childhood faith had been shattered, and what I saw underneath wasn't pretty. People who had seemed so loving and genuine when I was younger now revealed themselves to be petty, judgmental, and concerned more with appearances than authentic spirituality. Mrs. Henderson, who had always been quick with a hug and a kind word, began making comments about how my family needed to show more faith and stop wallowing in grief. She suggested that our continued sadness was actually a lack of trust in God's plan and a poor testimony to non-believers. According to her, we should be rejoicing that Michael was in heaven instead of mourning his absence. Her words cut deep because they came from someone I had trusted and looked up to. It was my first real glimpse into how cruel people could be while hiding behind religious language. Pastor Johnson, who had been such a comfort during those first terrible days, gradually became more concerned about my spiritual state than my emotional well-being. Instead of giving me space to grieve and question, he scheduled regular meetings to address my backsliding and spiritual rebellion. During these sessions, he would lecture me about the importance of accepting God's will and warn me that my doubts were opening doors for Satan in my life. When I tried to explain that I was struggling with the fundamental question of how a loving God could allow such senseless tragedy, he dismissed my concerns as immature thinking that I would grow out of. He told me that Job had faced worse trials and never questioned God, conveniently ignoring all the chapters where Job actually did question and even accused God of injustice. The message was clear. My questions weren't welcome, and my pain was less important than maintaining proper doctrine. The youth group, which had once felt like a second family, became a source of constant stress and judgment. Kids who had grown up with me now treated me like I was contagious, as if my doubts might somehow infect their own faith. Sarah, my former best friend, actually told other people that she was praying for God to deliver me from the spirit of bitterness that was obviously controlling me. When I overheard her sharing this prayer request during a group meeting, I felt completely betrayed. She had never even asked me how I was really doing or tried to understand what I was going through. Instead, she had turned my private struggles into gossip, disguised as spiritual concern. The other teenagers nodded along with her assessment, agreeing that something was clearly wrong with me spiritually, and that they needed to be careful not to let my negativity affect their own relationships with God. What hurt even more was watching how quickly people forgot about Michael once the initial shock wore off. Within a few months, it was like he had never existed. People stopped mentioning his name, stopped asking how our family was coping, and moved on to other church concerns and activities. But if we brought him up or showed any signs of ongoing grief, we were gently reminded that we needed to let go and let God, and trust in his perfect timing. The same people who had promised to walk through this valley with us were now uncomfortable with the reality that healing doesn't happen on their timeline. They wanted us to grieve quickly and quietly so they could get back to their comfortable lives without being reminded that terrible things can happen to faithful families. The church's financial priorities became another source of disillusionment for me. While my parents were struggling with medical bills and funeral expenses, the church was raising money for a new sound system and decorative lighting for the sanctuary. When Dad quietly asked if there might be some assistance available from the benevolence fund, he was told that the money was designated for truly needy families, implying that we didn't qualify because Dad had a job. Meanwhile, Pastor Johnson had just purchased a new luxury car and was planning an expensive vacation to the Holy Land. The contrast between Jesus' teachings about caring for the poor and suffering and the church's actual spending priorities was stark and hypocritical. It seemed like everyone was more concerned with having impressive facilities and comfortable leaders than actually living out the gospel they claimed to believe. I started noticing how differently people were treated based on their social status and financial contributions. The wealthy families in our congregation were given leadership positions and special recognition, while the working-class families were expected to serve quietly in the background. When old Mr. Martinez, who had faithfully attended our church for decades, lost his job and couldn't afford to tithe anymore, people started treating him like he wasn't pulling his weight spiritually. Mrs. Patterson, my former Sunday school teacher, actually suggested that his unemployment was probably the result of some unconfessed sin in his life. The message was clear. God's favor was measured by worldly success, and if you were struggling financially, it must be because you weren't right with God. The gossip disguised as prayer requests became unbearable to listen to. During Wednesday night prayer meetings, people would share concerns about other members that were really just opportunities to spread rumors and judgment. They would talk about who wasn't attending regularly, whose teenagers were acting out, which families seemed to be having marital problems, and who wasn't contributing enough financially. All of this gossip was presented as spiritual concern and requests for prayer, but it felt more like a weekly session of tearing people down while feeling righteous about it. I watched people nod sympathetically, while secretly enjoying the drama and feeling superior to whoever was being discussed. The contrast between this behavior and Jesus' teachings about love, forgiveness, and not judging others was impossible to ignore. The hypocrisy extended beyond individual relationships to the church's stance on social and political issues. They preached about loving your neighbor while supporting policies that hurt the poor and marginalized. They talked about the sanctity of life while showing no concern for children who were already born but living in poverty. They emphasized traditional family values, while many of the church leaders had been divorced multiple times or had serious problems in their own marriages that everyone knew about but pretended not to see. The selective application of biblical principles based on what was politically convenient or socially acceptable made me realize that most people weren't really interested in following Jesus. They just wanted to use Christianity to justify their existing beliefs and prejudices. Even worse was how the church handled moral failures among its leadership. When it came to light that one of our deacons had been having an affair for over a year, the response was to quietly move him to a different position and ask the congregation to pray for his restoration. But when a teenage girl in our youth group became pregnant, she was asked to step down from all leadership roles and publicly confess her sin before the congregation. The double standard was obvious and cruel. Men in positions of power were given grace and second chances, while young women who made mistakes were publicly shamed and treated as cautionary tales. This selective mercy showed me that the church was more interested in maintaining its reputation than actually practicing the forgiveness and redemption it preached about. By my senior year of high school, I had completely lost respect for the church as an institution. The people I had once looked up to as examples of Christian love and integrity had revealed themselves to be petty, judgmental hypocrites who cared more about appearances than genuine spirituality. They had failed me during the darkest period of my life, offering empty platitudes instead of real comfort and criticism instead of compassion. Their behavior was so contrary to everything Jesus taught that I began to wonder if Christianity itself was just a facade that people used to feel superior to others while avoiding the hard work of actually being good human beings. These experiences with church hypocrisy didn't just damage my faith, they filled me with active resentment toward organized religion and everyone who claimed to represent God. During my senior year of high school, I made a conscious decision that would define the next decade of my life. I officially rejected God and everything I had been raised to believe. It wasn't just doubt anymore, or anger over Michael's death. It was a deliberate choice to embrace atheism as my new worldview. The relief I felt was immediate and intoxicating. For years, I had been trying to force my experiences and observations into a religious framework that simply didn't fit. Now, suddenly, everything made sense. There was no loving God who had failed to protect my brother. There was just a random, uncaring universe where bad things happened to good people for no reason at all. This harsh truth was actually more comforting than the lies I'd been telling myself about divine plans and mysterious ways. At least reality was honest, even if it was brutal. I threw myself into studying atheist literature with the same passion I had once devoted to Bible study. I devoured books by Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, and Sam Harris, feeling like I had finally found authors who were willing to tell the truth about religion. Their arguments against God's existence weren't based on emotion or personal experience. They were logical, scientific, and devastating to religious claims. Dawkins showed me how evolution completely eliminated the need for a divine creator. Hitchens exposed the historical crimes and contradictions of organized religion. Harris demonstrated how religious faith was not just wrong, but actually dangerous to human progress. These men became my new heroes, intellectual warriors fighting against the superstition and ignorance that had controlled humanity for centuries. I started seeing religious people as either deluded or dishonest, possibly both. Anyone who still believed in God in the 21st century was either ignorant of scientific facts or willfully choosing fantasy over reality. I felt sorry for them in a condescending way, like adults feel sorry for children who still believe in Santa Claus. My parents, my former church friends, everyone who continued practicing Christianity. They were all victims of ancient myths and modern manipulation. The preachers and religious leaders were the worst because they had to know they were selling lies, but they continued doing it for money and power. I began to see myself as intellectually superior to believers, someone who had been brave enough to face reality, while others chose comfortable delusions. In college, I found my tribe among other atheist students and professors who shared my disdain for religion. We formed study groups dedicated to debunking religious claims and discussing the latest books by prominent atheist authors. I majored in philosophy with a focus on secular ethics and critical thinking, determined to build a worldview based on reason rather than faith. My professors encouraged my intellectual development and praised my papers criticizing religious arguments. For the first time since Michael's death, I felt like I belonged somewhere. These people understood that religion was humanity's greatest obstacle to progress and enlightenment. We saw ourselves as part of an important movement to free people from the chains of superstition and lead them into the light of rational thinking. I became what you might call a militant atheist, actively working to convert religious people to atheism, the same way missionaries try to convert people to Christianity. I would engage believers in debates on social media, pointing out contradictions in their holy books, and challenging them to provide evidence for their supernatural claims. I attended religious services just to find material I could use to mock their beliefs later. During family visits, I would corner relatives at dinner and lecture them about the historical inaccuracies in the Bible or the scientific impossibility of miracles. I genuinely believed I was helping these people by opening their eyes to truth, even when they clearly didn't want to hear what I had to say. Looking back, I can see how arrogant and obnoxious I must have been, but at the time, I felt like I was doing important work. My relationship with my parents became increasingly strained as I made my atheism more and more obvious. I refused to participate in family prayers, openly criticized their church, and would leave the room when they watched religious programs on television. During Christmas and Easter, I would give lectures about the pagan origins of these holidays and how Christianity had stolen traditions from earlier religions. I thought I was educating them, but I was really just being cruel to people who were still grieving their son and clinging to their faith for comfort. They tried to be patient with me, probably hoping this was just a phase I would grow out of, but I made it clear that I had permanently rejected everything they had taught me. The divide between us grew wider every year. I surrounded myself with books, documentaries, and online content that reinforced my atheist worldview. I watched debates where atheist philosophers destroyed religious apologists with logic and evidence. I read scientific journals that explained natural phenomena without needing to invoke supernatural causes. I studied the history of religion and learned about how different faiths had evolved and influenced each other over time, proving that they were all human inventions rather than divine revelations. This constant reinforcement made me absolutely certain that I was right, and that religious people were wrong. I felt intellectually bulletproof, armed with facts and reason against the ignorance and superstition of believers. The atheist community gave me a sense of purpose and identity that I had lost when I left Christianity. We had conferences, online forums, and local meetup groups where we could discuss our shared commitment to reason and skepticism. I volunteered for organizations that promoted separation of church and state, and fought against religious influence in public schools. I donated money to groups that were working to expose corruption in religious institutions and educate the public about the dangers of faith-based thinking. This activism made me feel like I was part of something important, a movement that would eventually free humanity from the darkness of religious delusion. I saw myself as a soldier in the war between reason and superstition. My atheism wasn't just intellectual. It became deeply personal and emotional. I was angry at religion for stealing my childhood innocence and filling my head with lies. I was furious at God, who I didn't believe existed, but somehow still blamed for my brother's death and my family's pain. I hated Christianity for promising peace and love while delivering judgment and hypocrisy. This anger fueled my activism and gave me energy to keep fighting against religious influence in society. I told myself that my rage was righteous, that I was justified in hating a system that had caused so much suffering throughout history. The more I learned about religious wars, persecution, and abuse, the more convinced I became that the world would be better off without faith entirely. By the time I graduated college, atheism had become the foundation of my entire identity. Everything I believed about morality, purpose, relationships, and the future was built on the assumption that there was no God and that religion was humanity's greatest enemy. I had spent years constructing this worldview carefully and defending it against any challenges. The idea that I might be wrong was literally unthinkable, because it would mean admitting that I had wasted years of my life and damaged important relationships for nothing. I was trapped in my own certainty, convinced that I had found ultimate truth in the rejection of everything sacred. Little did I know that this rigid atheism was about to lead me down an even darker path, one that would make my rejection of Christianity seem mild by comparison. I met Derek during my second year of graduate school at a philosophy conference focused on secular humanism and critical thinking. He was presenting a paper on the psychological damage caused by religious indoctrination in children, and I was immediately drawn to both his intellect and his passion for the subject. During the question and answer session, I asked him about his research on religious trauma, and we ended up talking for hours afterward at the hotel bar. He had a story similar to mine. Raised in a strict Catholic household, lost his faith in college, and now dedicated his life to helping others break free from religious conditioning. But where my atheism was born from personal tragedy, his seemed to come from pure intellectual conviction. He spoke about religion with a cold, analytical detachment that I found both attractive and intimidating. Derek was everything I thought I wanted in a partner. He was brilliant, holding a PhD in psychology, with a specialty in religious studies. He had published several papers debunking the psychological benefits that people claim to get from faith and prayer. He was also incredibly well-read in atheist literature, able to quote Nietzsche, Russell, and Dennett from memory during casual conversations. Most importantly, he understood my journey away from Christianity without judgment or attempts to reconcile me with my past beliefs. When I told him about Michael's death and how it had shattered my faith, he nodded knowingly and said that personal tragedy often provides the clarity needed to see through religious delusions. His matter-of-fact response was exactly what I wanted to hear at the time. Our relationship developed quickly, bonded by our shared contempt for religion and our commitment to rational thinking. We spent our dates visiting museums of natural history, attending lectures by prominent atheist speakers, and analyzing religious texts to find contradictions and absurdities. He introduced me to philosophical concepts I hadn't encountered before, like nihilism and existentialism, helping me understand that meaning in life had to be created, rather than discovered through divine revelation. We saw ourselves as intellectual partners in the fight against superstition, two enlightened individuals who had escaped the mental prison that trapped most of humanity. Our conversations were stimulating and intense, filled with big ideas about human nature, morality, and the future of civilization. What attracted me most to Derek was how completely he had rejected not just Christianity, but all forms of spirituality and transcendence. He had no patience for people who claimed to be spiritual but not religious, or who tried to find middle ground between faith and reason. According to him, any belief in anything beyond the material world was just wishful thinking dressed up in sophisticated language. He helped me see that my own rejection of God hadn't gone far enough. I was still clinging to romantic notions about human dignity, objective morality, and ultimate purpose that were really just secularized versions of religious thinking. True intellectual honesty, he argued, required accepting that we were nothing more than complex biological machines in a meaningless universe. Derek's influence on my thinking was profound and rapid. He recommended books that pushed me further away from any residual spiritual inclinations I might have had. Authors like Anton LaVey, Ayn Rand, and Max Stirner showed me that traditional morality was just another form of social control designed to make people weak and compliant. Derek taught me that concepts like love, compassion, and self-sacrifice were evolutionary accidents that modern humans needed to outgrow if we wanted to reach our full potential. He was particularly dismissive of people who left religion, but still tried to maintain Christian ethics, calling them intellectually inconsistent cowards who wanted the benefits of atheism without accepting its logical conclusions. Our relationship was built on a foundation of shared superiority over the sheep who still believed in fairy tales. We would attend family gatherings and religious services together, not out of respect for our relatives, but to gather material for our private conversations afterward, where we would dissect and mock everything we had witnessed. Derek was particularly good at identifying the psychological weaknesses that made people susceptible to religious manipulation. He could watch someone pray and explain exactly what emotional needs they were trying to fill, and how those needs could be met through more rational means. I found his analytical approach to human behavior fascinating, and started applying his methods to my own observations. Living with Derek meant being constantly challenged to become more intellectually rigorous and emotionally detached. He had no tolerance for what he called sentimental thinking, and would call me out whenever I expressed ideas that seemed influenced by my Christian upbringing. If I showed sympathy for someone who was struggling, he would remind me that suffering was just part of natural selection, and that trying to alleviate it was often counterproductive. When I felt sad about my estrangement from my parents, he pointed out that family loyalty was just biological programming that intelligent people should be able to overcome. He pushed me to be more honest about my own motivations and desires, stripping away layers of social conditioning that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. Derek's academic work focused on something he called religious deprogramming, helping people who had left their faith deal with the psychological aftermath of losing their worldview. But his approach wasn't about healing or finding new sources of meaning. Instead, he taught his clients to embrace the emptiness and purposelessness of existence as liberating truths that freed them from the need to find external validation for their lives. He believed that most people's problems stemmed from their inability to accept that they were alone in an indifferent universe, and that true mental health required abandoning all hope of cosmic significance or divine love. I started attending his workshops and found myself agreeing with his harsh but logical approach. Our relationship wasn't romantic in any traditional sense. Derek considered romantic love to be another religious myth that prevented people from seeing relationships clearly. We were partners in an intellectual project, two superior minds who had found each other in a world full of deluded masses. He taught me that emotions like jealousy, sentimentality, and attachment were weaknesses that needed to be overcome through rational analysis. Our connection was based on shared contempt for human weakness and shared commitment to facing reality without comforting illusions. When he proposed marriage, he presented it as a practical arrangement between two rational individuals rather than a declaration of love or commitment to traditional values. By the time we got married, I had completely adopted Derek's worldview and methods. I had learned to see human beings as nothing more than sophisticated animals, driven by biological impulses and social conditioning. Religion wasn't just wrong. It was contemptible evidence of humanity's weakness and intellectual dishonesty. People who still believed in God weren't just mistaken. They were inferior specimens who lacked the courage and intelligence to face reality. Derek had helped me complete my transformation from a heartbroken teenager, questioning her faith, into a cold, analytical adult who saw herself as evolved beyond the need for meaning, purpose, or transcendence. I thought I had reached the pinnacle of intellectual development, but I was actually standing at the edge of an abyss that would soon swallow what remained of my humanity. At first, our rejection of religion felt like liberation, but over time, the emptiness became impossible to ignore. Derek would say that staring into the void was the only honest way to live, but I began to crave something more. Not faith, not God, but power. It started innocently enough, or at least it felt that way at the time. I stumbled across a book Derek kept hidden among his academic volumes, The Satanic Bible by Anton LaVey. At first, I laughed at the theatrics of it, but the more I read, the more it resonated with the bitter cynicism that had been growing inside me. Unlike Christianity, which demanded submission and sacrifice, LaVey's philosophy celebrated self-interest, pride, and dominance. For the first time since losing my faith, I felt like I had found a system that didn't just deny God, but actively mocked him. When I showed the book to Derek, he didn't dismiss it. Instead, he admitted that he had experimented with ritual practices during his early years of deconversion. He explained that, for him, Satan wasn't a literal being, but a symbol, the ultimate rejection of divine authority, the embodiment of human freedom. He said rituals could be psychologically powerful tools to break the last chains of religious conditioning. That night, we lit black candles in our living room, drew a crude pentagram on the floor, and recited passages from LaVey's text. We laughed afterward, telling ourselves it was just performance art, an intellectual exercise in mocking superstition. But something shifted inside me. The ritual felt alive. I couldn't explain it, but when I stood in that circle and spoke those words, I felt a surge of energy, as though I was finally taking back everything God had stolen from me. From there, the descent was quick. Derek had contacts with a local group that called themselves the Order of the Black Flame. At first, I thought it was just an academic club, ex-Christians and skeptics who enjoyed playing with dark symbolism. But when we attended our first gathering, I realized it was much more. They wore robes, chanted in strange tongues, and performed rituals that mirrored Christian sacraments, but twisted them into grotesque parodies. The leader of the group, a man who called himself Marcus, spoke directly to the rage I had carried for years. He said Christianity was nothing but a religion of weakness, designed to enslave humanity under the weight of guilt and false promises. He promised that through their rituals, we could strip away every trace of that conditioning and rise as our true selves, fearless, powerful, unbound by morality. I should have felt alarmed. Instead, I felt exhilarated. The more grotesque the rituals became, the more I convinced myself that I was finally free. Derek encouraged me every step of the way, saying that only by embracing the darkest symbols could I prove I was truly beyond the reach of God. It was during one of those ceremonies that I felt something I still struggle to put into words. We were chanting, the air thick with incense and smoke, when the room seemed to pulse with an energy that wasn't human. My skin prickled, my chest tightened, and for a moment I thought I saw shadows moving independently of the candlelight. I brushed it off as imagination, a trick of the mind, heightened by ritual and suggestion. But deep down, I knew it was something more. Something had taken notice of me. By the time I became pregnant with our son, Derek and I were no longer just mocking God. We were openly, deliberately, aligning ourselves against him. When I discovered I was pregnant, my first reaction wasn't joy. It was dread, mixed with defiance. Derek and I had built our lives on rejecting everything sacred, and the idea of bringing a child into the world felt like both a challenge and an opportunity. In the quiet of our apartment, staring at the positive test in my trembling hands, I felt the old remnants of my Christian upbringing try to resurface. Somewhere deep in my chest, a voice whispered that children were a gift from God, a blessing entrusted to parents with sacred responsibility. I crushed that thought immediately, telling myself it was just leftover programming. Instead, I turned to Derek, and with a cold smile I said, "This child will be proof that we are completely free from him." His eyes lit up with a spark of something I can only describe as sinister agreement. We decided then and there that this baby wouldn't just be born into a godless home, it would be raised as a living declaration of our rebellion. Throughout the pregnancy, I could feel two wars being fought inside me. One was physical, the exhaustion, the sickness, the way my body changed in ways I couldn't control. The other was spiritual, though at the time I would never have admitted it. Late at night, I would wake to the sound of my own heartbeat echoing like thunder, and I'd place my hands on my growing stomach and wonder if some unseen force was watching. Derek dismissed my unease, reminding me that pregnancy was just biology, a meaningless process replicated across the animal kingdom. "Don't romanticize it," he said coldly. "It's no different than a wolf giving birth in the wild." But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that this life inside me was different, that he wasn't just a random clump of cells, but something precious. Instead of comforting me, that thought made me angry. If he was precious, then God still had power over me, and I refused to let that be true. As my belly grew, so did our discussions about how to raise the child. Derek suggested a purely secular upbringing, education in science, philosophy, and critical thinking. But I felt that wasn't enough. I wanted something more defiant, something that would spit in the face of the God I had once worshipped. It wasn't enough to simply ignore him. I wanted to mock him, to prove that his supposed sovereignty had no claim on me or my family. That's when the idea of a satanic dedication first entered my mind. The Order of the Black Flame had ceremonies for everything: initiations, marriages, even funerals twisted into grotesque parodies of Christian rituals. Why not a baptism? Why not take the most sacred Christian act and corrupt it into something unholy? The thought thrilled me and terrified me at the same time. Derek, of course, encouraged it. "Now you're thinking clearly," he said, his smile sharp like a blade. The order welcomed the idea with almost fanatical enthusiasm. Marcus, their leader, told us it would be the ultimate declaration of freedom. What greater proof of liberation than dedicating your offspring not to the false shepherd, but to the true flame? He asked, his eyes gleaming under the candlelight. I felt a rush of adrenaline as the group applauded the decision. For weeks leading up to the birth, they prepared me with dark prayers and rituals designed to sever any lingering ties to Christianity. They anointed my swollen belly with oils while chanting curses against the name of Christ, and they made me recite vows renouncing any divine claim over my child. Each time I repeated the words, my voice shook, not because I doubted, but because somewhere deep inside, a small, dying part of me still feared I might be crossing a line from which there would be no return. When my son was finally born, the moment was nothing like the natural beauty I had read about in parenting books. There were no tears of joy, no holy awe. Instead, I felt empty, as though I had delivered not a child, but a burden placed upon me by fate. Derek cut the cord with the detached precision of a surgeon, his face expressionless. I looked at the tiny boy in my arms, his fragile chest rising and falling, his eyes blinking against the harsh hospital lights, and for a fleeting second, my heart ached. He was innocent, untouched by the darkness we had chosen. That fleeting tenderness frightened me. I pushed it down violently, reminding myself that weakness was a trap, a leftover from the Christian lies I thought I had escaped. By the time we left the hospital, I had convinced myself again. This child wasn't a gift from God. He was a weapon, a declaration, a living monument to our rebellion. The weeks that followed were a blur of exhaustion and indoctrination. The order visited frequently, congratulating us and reminding me of the upcoming ceremony. Marcus would hold my son and whisper words I didn't understand, his lips brushing the baby's forehead in mockery of a blessing. Sometimes, I caught the baby staring at Marcus with wide, unblinking eyes, as if he could see something I couldn't. Those moments unsettled me, but I quickly rationalized them away. Babies don't understand, Derek reminded me. You're projecting your own fears onto him. Still, every time I nursed him, I felt torn in two. One part of me fiercely protective, another part determined to follow through with our plan no matter the cost. It was as if motherhood itself was fighting against my ideology, and I was too stubborn to admit I was losing. Finally, the night of the dedication arrived. The order prepared their temple with black drapes, red candles, and the smell of burning incense that clung to my skin like poison. The air inside was heavy, oppressive, almost suffocating. Derek held our son tightly in his arms as we walked to the center of the circle, where Marcus stood waiting with an ornate chalice filled with dark liquid. Tonight, Marcus declared, we declare this child free from the chains of heaven, bound not by the false god above, but by the flame within. His voice echoed off the stone walls, and the congregation responded with guttural chants. My heart pounded so hard I could barely hear the words, and for the first time, I felt a flicker of panic. What if we were wrong? What if this wasn't just symbolism? But I swallowed my fear and stepped forward. As the ceremony began, Marcus dipped his fingers into the chalice and traced a symbol onto my son's forehead. The baby whimpered, his tiny fists clenching as though he could feel the weight of something invisible pressing down on him. My breath caught in my throat, but Derek squeezed my shoulder and whispered, "Stay strong." I nodded, though every instinct screamed at me to grab my child and run. Marcus lifted his arms and called upon powers I dared not name, his voice deepening until it seemed to vibrate the very air. The chanting grew louder, faster, a frenzied rhythm that made the ground feel unsteady beneath my feet. My son began to cry. Not the ordinary wail of hunger or discomfort, but a sound so piercing and raw that it cut straight through me. The congregation cheered, taking his cries as a sign of the ritual's power. But for me, it felt like a warning. The moment that haunts me most came when Marcus held my son aloft, declaring him a child of the flame. The baby's cries turned into a scream so intense that every candle in the room flickered violently, some even extinguishing themselves. A cold wind swept through the temple, though no doors or windows were open. I felt my knees buckle, my vision blur, and for the first time in years, I silently prayed, not to Satan, not to the void, but to the God I had abandoned. It was instinctive, desperate, and utterly against everything I had sworn to believe. "God, please," I whispered inside my mind. though I dared not speak aloud. At that exact moment, Marcus froze, his words stumbling as though something unseen had gripped his tongue. The congregation looked around in confusion, their chants faltering. My son's scream cut through the silence like a blade, and the air itself seemed to tremble. That night marked the beginning of the end for everything I thought I believed. As Derek and I left the temple with our son, my body shook with a fear I couldn't rationalize away. For the first time, I felt that we had crossed into something real, something dark, dangerous, and beyond human control. I clutched my baby tightly against my chest, his small body trembling as though he had absorbed the terror I felt. Derek tried to calm me, insisting that the flickering candles and sudden wind were just coincidences, tricks of the environment. But deep down, I knew better. Something had happened in that room, something that had pierced through the layers of my rebellion and touched the very core of my soul. I had wanted to mock God, to spit in his face, but instead I had awakened something I didn't understand. And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the terrifying thought that he had been there all along, watching. The night had arrived, heavy with silence, broken only by the crackling of torches and the low chants that echoed inside the abandoned warehouse. Dozens of figures in black robes surrounded a circle drawn with salt and ash. At the center stood a wooden altar, stained with offerings of the past. The air smelled of incense and iron, a mix that made every breath burn like poison. She held her newborn in trembling arms, but her face was set in stone. This was the moment she had promised. Her heart raced, not with maternal love, but with defiance, a hatred so deep it disguised itself as strength. She believed this act would seal her rebellion forever. The leader of the coven, a tall man with hollow eyes and a serpent tattoo that coiled up his neck, stepped forward with a chalice of dark liquid. His voice was raspy, yet commanding, carrying authority over the group. He raised the chalice to the sky, calling upon unseen powers, and the congregation responded in unison, chanting words that twisted like smoke through the air. The sound was unnatural, low frequencies that vibrated in her chest, making her grip the child tighter. She wanted to turn back, but pride anchored her in place. This was the sacrifice she had chosen, the rebellion she could not undo. They laid the baby upon the altar, wrapping him in a cloth marked with occult symbols. The firelight flickered against the child's innocent face, illuminating his small, fragile features. For the first time, her composure cracked. The purity of the baby's eyes seemed to pierce through her rage, reflecting something she had buried long ago. A faint whisper inside her mind asked, "What if you are wrong?" She pushed the thought away, gripping the dagger they had placed in her hand. The ritual required a drop of blood, a mark of dedication, and she was the one chosen to cut the child. Her hands trembled as she lifted the blade. The congregation chanted louder, the room vibrating with demonic fervor. The leader's voice rose above the chaos, calling on ancient spirits to claim the child's destiny. She felt her chest tighten, as though invisible hands were pressing down on her lungs. Sweat dripped down her forehead, blurring her vision. Her ears rang with a high-pitched sound that drowned even the chants. She stood frozen, staring at her baby, who began to cry softly. The cry wasn't ordinary. It was piercing, almost melodic, as if cutting through the darkness itself. At that moment, the flames of the torches bent unnaturally, all flickering in the same direction. The air grew heavier, pressing down like a storm about to break. Some of the robed figures faltered in their chants, their voices stuttering as if an unseen force had disrupted them. A wind, cold and unexplainable, swept through the room, extinguishing 2 of the torches. The baby's cry grew louder, echoing off the walls like a chorus, like a defiance that didn't belong to him, but to something greater. Fear crept into her heart. She had seen rituals before, but never anything like this. The leader snarled, trying to regain control. He grabbed her wrist, forcing the dagger toward the child. His grip was like iron, cold and merciless, but as the blade neared the baby's skin, it slipped from her trembling hand, clattering loudly on the altar. The sound pierced the air like a gunshot, silencing the chants in an instant. Every eye turned toward her, filled with fury and confusion. She couldn't move. Her knees buckled, and she fell against the altar, clutching her son to her chest. Something unseen surrounded them, a presence that felt both terrifying and protective. Then it happened. A blinding light erupted in the center of the room, so bright that the coven screamed and covered their faces. It wasn't fire, nor electricity. It was pure radiance, warm yet overwhelming, filling every corner of darkness. The warehouse shook, as if the ground itself rejected the ritual. The child stopped crying, his eyes wide open, gazing at the light as if he recognized it. She felt it too, a force so holy, so beyond comprehension, that her hatred melted into ashes within seconds. Her chest loosened, her breath returned, and for the first time in years, tears flowed freely from her eyes. The robed figures fled in panic, stumbling over each other, their chants forgotten. The leader cursed loudly, trying to resist, but the light burned his skin, leaving marks like fire. He screamed and disappeared into the shadows, never to return. She remained kneeling, clutching her child, unable to move but unwilling to run. The light surrounded her, filling her with warmth she had never known. It was as if hands, not human, but divine, lifted her from the ground and whispered to her soul, "This child is mine, and so are you." Her rebellion shattered in an instant. Everything she thought she believed collapsed under the weight of that presence. She felt naked before it, all her hatred, all her sins exposed. But instead of condemnation, she felt love, a love so pure it terrified her more than any ritual ever had. She sobbed uncontrollably, pressing her forehead against her baby's tiny head. She whispered apologies to her child, to herself, to the God she had mocked and rejected for years. The words came without her control. "Forgive me, forgive me." When the light faded, the warehouse was empty. The torches were extinguished, the symbols erased as if they had never existed. Only silence remained, broken by the steady heartbeat of her son against her chest. She rose slowly, legs weak, but spirit transformed. She walked out of the warehouse into the night, no longer carrying hatred, but a seed of faith she didn't yet understand. She had tried to dedicate her child to darkness, but heaven had claimed him instead, and in that moment, she realized God had also claimed her. The moment I stepped out of the warehouse, clutching my son to my chest, the world felt both familiar and utterly changed. The cool night air brushed against my skin, but instead of relief, I felt a tremor of awe, as though the entire universe had shifted on its axis. Every sound, the distant hum of traffic, the rustle of leaves, seemed amplified, imbued with a presence I couldn't name. My heart, which had carried hatred and defiance for years, now throbbed with an unfamiliar rhythm, one that spoke of mercy, patience, and something infinitely greater than I could comprehend. I realized, with a clarity that shook me to my core, that I was being watched, guided, and protected. As we walked away from the temple, my son cooed softly, his tiny hands grasping at the folds of my jacket. But his eyes, innocent and piercing, seemed to reflect a light that didn't exist in the physical world. I felt a warmth radiate from him, as if a fire had been lit inside that was untouched by human understanding or earthly corruption. Each step I took was heavy with disbelief. I had rejected God for so long, mocked his name, and yet here, in the stillness of the night, I felt him, undeniable, patient, and sovereign. For the first time in years, I realized my rebellion had been futile. Later that night, when I lay the baby down in his crib, exhaustion pulled at my limbs, but my mind refused rest. I drifted in and out of consciousness, trapped in a liminal space between sleep and wakefulness. In those moments, I saw visions, scenes of my life, moments of grief and doubt, every act of pride and defiance laid bare. And then, without warning, I saw a figure bathed in light, gentle yet commanding, who spoke not with words, but directly into my mind. "You are not beyond my reach. Come back to me." The force of it was overwhelming, not punishing, but inviting, calling me to a truth I had spent a lifetime denying. I awoke drenched in sweat, trembling, yet unable to speak. My son's soft breathing was the only sound, yet the presence lingered, heavy and undeniable. The air around me seemed charged with energy, a vibration I could feel in my chest. Every fiber of my being wanted to resist, to cling to my intellect, to the rational detachment I had spent years cultivating. But the presence didn't threaten, didn't coerce. It simply was. And I knew, beyond any doubt, that I was not alone. I had mocked God, rejected him, tried to embrace nothingness, but he had been there all along, waiting patiently for the moment I would look up and see. Over the following days, a series of events unfolded that I could not explain. Small, seemingly coincidental moments, the kindness of strangers, objects appearing in the exact place I needed them, whispered words in my mind during moments of fear, accumulated like drops filling a bucket. Each one seemed trivial on its own, but together, they formed a mosaic that I could not rationalize away. The veil I had drawn over my perception of the divine began to lift, revealing a reality I had long denied. With every heartbeat, every breath, I felt a force drawing me back to something I had once called faith, something I had believed to be gone forever. One evening, alone in my apartment, I prayed, not because I wanted God to forgive me, but because I could no longer silence the longing inside. The words trembled on my lips. I don't know if you exist, but if you do, please help me. Immediately, a calm descended upon me, like a gentle hand brushing away layers of fear and despair, which had been a battlefield of logic and doubt, became quiet. I felt a profound love that transcended comprehension, a love that did not question my past, that did not demand proof. It was unconditional, all-encompassing, and utterly humbling. In that moment, I began to understand what it meant to be seen, fully and completely, by a divine presence. The nights were no longer filled with fear or restless thoughts. My son, once a symbol of defiance, now became a vessel of grace in my eyes. Every coup, every tiny movement, seemed infused with a meaning I had long denied. I would watch him sleep, and the light that had appeared in the temple seemed to linger, soft and protective, wrapping both of us in warmth. I realized that the attempt to dedicate him to darkness had failed because something far greater had claimed him first. And in claiming him, I too had been claimed, drawn back into a life I had believed was lost. Dreams followed, vivid and unrelenting. I saw my past in fragments, moments of grief, moments of cruelty, moments when I had tried to harden my heart against God. And in each dream, I felt a presence, patient and sorrowful, yet full of mercy. Sometimes I wept, sometimes I screamed in frustration, but each vision left me more aware of the depth of His grace. I began to recognize that my life had been a series of missteps guided by anger and hurt, yet even my rebellion had not been wasted. It had prepared me to understand the magnitude of what I was now experiencing, the patient, relentless love of God seeking to restore a lost child. By the time morning came, I felt different, not just in spirit, but in mind and body. The heaviness that had dominated me for years, the constant compulsion to mock and reject, had lifted. I could feel a clarity, a peace I had never known, and the terror that had accompanied my attempts to control every outcome had dissolved. For the first time in a long time, I knelt beside my son, pressed my forehead to his, and wept tears of gratitude and surrender. I whispered words I had never imagined saying. I see you now, God. I hear you. Thank you for not leaving me. That night marked the true turning point. I no longer questioned whether He existed. I felt Him coursing through every part of my being. I had tried to dedicate my son to darkness, to prove my independence, to reject all that I had once held sacred, but every act of rebellion had been intercepted by a love far beyond comprehension. In that instant, I understood that the darkness I had embraced was never stronger than the light that awaited me. And for the first time, I wept not from fear, not from despair, but from the overwhelming, unshakable realization that I had been found, forgiven, and claimed. The moment Derek realized what had happened inside the temple, his face changed. The cold, calculating man I had married suddenly seemed small, powerless, and desperate. He tried to argue, to rationalize, to convince me that what we had done was still ours to control. But I could no longer hear his voice as authority. It was hollow, meaningless. The presence I had felt, the one that had intervened, was still with us, wrapping me and the baby in a protective light I could feel even outside the warehouse. I took a deep breath, and for the first time in years, I acted purely on instinct. I turned my back on Derek and walked out. We fled into the night, the city streets unfamiliar and frightening, but I didn't look back. Derek called after me, screaming, pleading, but the words sounded thin, like air escaping through a crack. Every step I took with my son pressed against my chest felt like a reclaiming of life, a severing of chains I hadn't known were binding me. The baby's cries, once a symbol of my defiance, now became my compass. I whispered promises I didn't fully understand yet, vowing to protect him, to honor the spark of light that had intervened on our behalf. We didn't stop until the city lights faded behind us, and only then did I allow myself to notice the cold biting at my skin. My chest heaved with panic and relief simultaneously. I had abandoned Derek, severed the life we had built on shared rebellion, and yet, despite every rational warning screaming in my mind, I felt no regret. There was only a strange, powerful clarity. This was right. The darkness we had embraced had lost, and we were alive, because something far greater had intervened. Finding a place to rest was difficult. Every hotel and apartment we passed seemed unsafe, as if Derek could track us through some unseen network. But finally, a small, welcoming chapel appeared at the edge of town, its stained glass windows faintly glowing in the moonlight. I felt drawn to it, inexplicably. Something deep inside me, a voice I had tried to silence for years, whispered that we could find sanctuary there. Holding my son close, I crossed the threshold, expecting silence or suspicion, but instead, I was met with warmth. Inside, the congregation was small, simple, and unassuming. They were unaware of the chaos that had followed us, yet they welcomed us without question. I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Acceptance, not judgment, not analysis, not control, just grace. One of the women approached me, her eyes soft, and asked if we were safe. I nodded, tears streaming down my face. The baby gurgled, and for the first time since birth, his cry was one of comfort rather than terror. The contrast was staggering. I realized that this ordinary human kindness was nothing less than divine intervention in disguise. Derek never found us. I didn't know if he would try, or if he even could, but it didn't matter. I had severed the ties to that life, to that ideology, to the man who had once guided my descent. I realized that our intellectual rebellion, the pride that had fueled our cruelty, had no power here. The light that had protected us was far stronger than any philosophy, any ritual, any human defiance. I felt it in the warmth surrounding my son, in the calm that settled over my own racing heart, in the gentle looks of strangers who had become instruments of mercy. The pastor, a quiet man with kind eyes, listened as I recounted what had happened, carefully, honestly, leaving nothing out. I spoke of the temple, of the rituals, of the darkness I had embraced, and I spoke of the light, the presence that had intervened in ways I could barely describe. He nodded without shock or judgment. He simply said, "You were never beyond his reach. He brought you here." The words struck me with a force I could not ignore. For the first time in years, I believed something fully, without question, without argument. Over the next few days, I began to feel the weight of what I had carried for years begin to lift. The fear, the hatred, the intellectual pride, all of it seemed meaningless now. I focused entirely on my son, on nurturing him, and on learning to accept the grace I had been offered. I prayed for the first time in decades, stumbling over words that felt foreign yet necessary. And every time I spoke, I felt a gentle reassurance, a confirmation that we were safe and watched, that the intervention had not been a fleeting miracle, but the beginning of something far larger. I knew returning to Derek or the order was impossible, and I didn't want to. My loyalty, my heart, and my mind had shifted irrevocably. I understood now that the life I had lived with him, no matter how logical or compelling it seemed, had been a prison. I had been chained to pride, intellect, and vengeance. The escape was not just physical. It was spiritual, emotional, and eternal. For the first time, I felt freedom not as a concept, but as a living reality flowing through me and my son. By the time we left the chapel to settle into a permanent home nearby, I felt a strange calm. The horrors we had endured, the terror, the manipulation, and even my own complicity seemed distant, like a shadow that could no longer touch me. Every step forward was guided by a hand I could feel, but not see. My son slept peacefully in my arms, and I whispered promises of love and protection, understanding finally that we had been given more than safety. We had been given life, renewed and guarded by a power that I had once refused to acknowledge but could no longer deny. When I finally accepted the invitation to be baptized, it was not out of obligation or fear, but from a profound sense of awe and surrender. The water felt colder than I expected, yet somehow comforting, like a cleansing that reached beyond the physical. My son, held gently beside me, gurgled with curiosity, as though sensing the significance of the moment. The pastor spoke words I had long ignored, words I now felt resonate deep within my soul. Through this water, you are reborn in Christ. For the first time in years, I felt truly seen, fully alive, and profoundly connected to something eternal. The ceremony was simple, intimate, and yet it carried a weight I had never known. Friends from the church held our hands, their presence grounding me in a community I had avoided for decades. As the pastor lowered me into the water and lifted me again, a wave of peace washed over me, sweeping away the fear, the rage, and the pride that had dominated my life. I realized that every step I had taken, every mistake, every act of rebellion, had led to this moment. God had never left me. He had merely waited for me to stop running. My son's baptism followed immediately, and I could barely hold back tears. Seeing him immersed in the water, surrounded by voices of prayer and blessing, was surreal. This was the life I had tried to reject, the love I had denied, now flowing into the heart of my child. I whispered promises into his ear, vows to protect, nurture, and guide him in faith. It was more than ritual. It was a reclamation, a declaration that darkness would no longer claim him, that he belonged to light and life, just as I finally did. In the weeks that followed, I began attending church regularly, absorbing lessons I had long scorned. Every sermon, every hymn, every prayer stirred something dormant inside me. I had spent years convinced that reason and logic were my only companions, but now I felt something beyond understanding, an undeniable presence that guided, comforted, and corrected me. For the first time, I felt aligned, no longer torn between intellect and belief. The knowledge that I was no longer alone reshaped my understanding of existence itself. The transformation was not instantaneous, but gradual, like dawn breaking after the longest night. I had to relearn how to trust, how to love without calculation, how to surrender control. Derek's influence, once so strong and oppressive, faded like a shadow at sunrise. I began to see my past with clarity, not as shame, but as a story of redemption, a path God had used to bring me to this place of humility and hope. Every act of rebellion, every lapse in judgment, now appeared as preparation for the life I had finally been given. I dedicated myself to prayer and reflection, seeking guidance for the challenges of motherhood and faith. I discovered that God's presence was not distant or punitive, but intimate and patient. I began to experience miracles, both small and large, moments of protection, unexpected provision, and comfort in times of anxiety. Each day reinforced the reality that my life had been transformed, that my child and I were living proof of God's mercy, and that the light I had once rejected was now the foundation of every choice I made. I also felt compelled to share my story, to warn others of the seductive dangers of rebellion and the power of divine intervention. My testimony became my mission. I spoke to friends, neighbors, and eventually strangers, recounting my descent into atheism and occult practices, the terror of the temple, and the overwhelming love that pulled me back to God. Every word I shared was a testament not to my strength, but to God's. I wanted others to see that no one is beyond His reach, and that even the deepest darkness can be overcome by His light. The church community became my second family, a network of support and love that healed the wounds left by years of rejection and doubt. I found mentors who guided me in faith, who encouraged me to grow spiritually while nurturing my child. Each Sunday, as I watched my son participate in the songs, the prayers, and the lessons, I felt a profound sense of continuity, a link between past suffering and present joy. Faith was no longer abstract. It was lived, breathed, and shared in every moment of our daily lives. Today, I live a life dedicated to God, raising my son in the faith I once scorned, and speaking openly about the perils of rebellion and the redemptive power of divine love. I mentor young mothers, share my testimony at gatherings, and offer counsel to those struggling with doubt or despair. Every encounter reminds me of the intervention that changed my life, the presence that I could not escape, and the mercy that continues to guide me. I am no longer afraid, no longer lost. I am home. Looking back, I can see the journey in its entirety, the pain, the rebellion, the terror, and the transformation. I am grateful for every moment, even the darkest, because they led me here. My son sleeps peacefully beside me as I write this, a living testament to the miracle we experienced. And I know now, without question, that God's intervention was real, that His love is relentless, and that anyone willing to surrender, even after years of defiance, can find a new life in Christ. Our story is not just survival. It is rebirth, hope, and eternal promise.